There is something oddly comforting about the sound of history told at night. When the day has worn itself out and the world outside grows quiet, our minds often wander to places far from here, to landscapes we've never touched, and yet, somehow, feel familiar. Tonight, I'd like to take you to a time when the island of Britain was not the land we know now, when it was divided into kingdoms, alive with warriors, poets, and quiet monks scratching ink onto parchment by the glow of oil lamps. This is the story of the Anglo-Saxons, a people who, for centuries, shaped the very language you and I speak today. Their tale is a long river, winding through conquests, faith, and the slow weaving together of kingdoms into something greater. It begins with ships, sleek, wooden, creaking against the waves, carrying men from across the North Sea. It ends with the shadow of the Norman conquest, and yet, between those points, it is rich with stories of courage, betrayal, artistry, and survival. I want you to imagine the salt wind against your face as you look toward the eastern horizon of early medieval Britain. Picture the green hills rolling down to the sea and the deep forests where wolves still roamed. Hear the clang of iron at the forge, the low murmur of prayers in monasteries, the distant beat of war drums. This isn't just a chronicle of dates and battles. It's the heartbeat of a culture, one that still whispers through the place names, poems, and customs of modern England. As we travel together through this history, let yourself sink deeper into the sound of the words. If you're listening in bed, let your eyes grow heavy. If you're somewhere far away from Britain, perhaps you'll find yourself tracing these events on a map in your mind. And if you're watching in the middle of the day, well, you might still find your mind wandering down old, cobbled streets in forgotten villages. Before we begin, I'd love to know, from where in the world are you listening to this? Is it morning where you are, with the sun painting your walls gold? Or night, with the hum of quiet around you? Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy hearing where these stories are finding their homes. So, settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the centuries slip past us until we find ourselves in an age where kingdoms were young and the world felt vast. Hello, this is Sherry here, and welcome to my channel. So here we go. The year is somewhere around the middle of the 5th century. Britain is a land in transition, almost in mourning for the order that once held it together. The Romans have gone. Their roads remain, stretching like veins across the countryside. Their stone walls crumble slowly under moss, but the legions are no more. Far to the east, across the restless gray waters of the North Sea, other lands stir. The winds sweep over the sandy coasts of what we now call Denmark, northern Germany, and the Low Countries. Here live the tribes the Romans once called the Angli, the Saxons, and the Judy seafaring peoples, hardened by winters that bite at the bone, and summers that are brief but bright. They live close to the sea, in wooden halls that smell of smoke and salt, their lives bound to the tides. It begins with whispers of an island far to the west, island with fertile fields and mild winters, where land can be claimed by those strong enough to hold it. For generations, the people here have known how to read the wind, how to carve sleek, open boats that dance on the crests of waves. And now, for some, the call of that distant shore becomes too strong to ignore. The first ships that push out from the coast are long and narrow, their hulls flexing gently as the water heaves beneath them. Oars flash in the morning light. Cloth sails billow with the push of the wind. The men aboard wear tunics bound at the waist, cloaks clasped with bronze pins, and at their sides hang the long, leaf-shaped blades of their seaxes. They bring not just weapons and tools, but wives, children, and the few belongings they can carry. Iron cauldrons, carved cups, and bundles of wool to spin into cloth when they reach their new home. The crossing is not kind. The North Sea is a thing of moods, now calm, now vicious. They must steer by the sun and the stars, their hands numb with cold, their eyes stinging with salt. Storms can sweep in without warning, and to be caught in one is to feel the raw power of a god's hand pressing against your chest. Yet the promise of Britain draws them on. When at last the coastline rises out of the haze, it feels almost dreamlike. Green slopes roll down to low beaches, and the land smells different, softer somehow. There are no stone cities here to greet them, no armies waiting on the shore. Only scattered settlements, the smoke of hearths rising into the air, and beyond that, the vast wildness of forests and marshes. Some come as mercenaries at first, hired by local warlords to defend against raiders from the north. Others arrive simply to settle, to carve out space for their families in the open land. But as more ships follow, the arrivals begin to outnumber the locals in certain places. New villages appear along the coasts, their timber halls built in the style of the homeland. The old Roman towns, crumbling and quiet, are often left behind. This migration is not one great invasion all at once, but a tide that rises steadily. Each season, more sails appear on the horizon. Angles claim the fertile valleys of the north and east. Saxons spread along the southern shores, and the Jutes take root in Kent. Over time, the lines between these groups blur, but for now, each carries the memory of the shore they left behind. And so, Britain begins to change. New languages take root in its soil, the seeds of Old English. New gods are worshipped under the open sky. New warriors walk its fields. What the people of Rome once called Britannia is slipping into another identity, shaped by the hands of those who came over the sea. But the island they have come to is not empty, and not everyone will welcome them. Shadows of the past linger here, and soon the newcomers will find themselves in a struggle not only for land, but for survival. And in that struggle, the first foundations of Anglo-Saxon England will be laid. But they will be forged in both friendship and blood. Before the first longships appeared on the horizon, before the foreign tongues of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes began to shape the language of the island. Britain had already been living through a quiet unraveling. For nearly 4 centuries, this land had been under the embrace, some would say the grip, of Rome. The legions first came in the time of Emperor Claudius, in AD 43, their polished armor glinting in the British sun, their eagles held high. They brought with them the discipline of an empire, the ordered grid of stone-built towns, the rhythm of tax and tribute, the hum of commerce that connected the windswept coasts of Britannia to the far-off markets of Gaul, Iberia, and Rome itself. But empires, like all human things, are fragile under the weight of time. By the early 5th century, cracks had spread across the Roman world. Pressures along the empire's borders demanded troops elsewhere. The great cities of the Mediterranean faced threats and political storms. Gold and authority alike began to flow away from this northern outpost. Britain was not abandoned overnight. That is the mistake many imagine. But gradually, like a candle burning lower each year, the first signs were subtle. Garrisons along Hadrian's Wall received fewer supplies, fewer reinforcements. Governors were left to their own devices for longer stretches. Local leaders, Romano-British elites, who had once been content to serve under imperial order, began to make decisions without consulting distant authority. Then came the year 410, a date later chroniclers would mark as the symbolic end of Roman Britain. The Emperor Honorius, embroiled in defending Italy itself, is said to have sent a letter to the cities of Britain, telling them to look to their own defense. Whether this was a formal severing of ties, or simply a reflection of what had already happened hardly mattered. The legions were gone, and the island was on its own, and so the carefully woven fabric of Roman life began to fray. The great towns Londinium, Verulamium, Eboracum still stood, their forums and basilicas echoing with the footfalls of traders and magistrates, but without the machinery of empire, their luster dimmed. Roads fell into disrepair, their stones cracked and weeded. Villas in the countryside, once alive with mosaics and painted walls, saw their tiled roofs sag. Their owners could no longer rely on a distant Rome to enforce peace or prosperity. Trade became more local. Coins grew scarce, and barter returned to prominence. Craftsmen still worked, but fewer imported goods reached these shores. Fine pottery from Gaul, glass from the Rhineland, oil from Spain, all became rare luxuries. Britain's people were slowly turning inward again, relying on what they could grow, raise, or forge nearby. Yet, it was not a complete collapse. The Romano-British world lingered, especially in the south and east. The Latin tongue was still spoken among the educated, though British Celtic remained in the countryside. The Christian faith, which had found its way into Britain during the later Roman period, held on in certain communities, especially among the elite. Bishops still presided in some towns, sending representatives to councils on the continent. political order had changed. Without the central authority of Rome, power fragmented. Local chieftains, landowners, and former military leaders rose to fill the vacuum. They commanded small warbands, ruled patches of territory, and settled disputes by their own authority. For ordinary villagers, loyalty was no longer to an emperor across the sea, but to the nearest strongman who could keep raiders away from their fields. And raiders did come. Even before the Anglo-Saxon migrations, Britain had been familiar with foreign threats. From the north, Picts crossed Hadrian's Wall, striking into undefended lands. From the west, the Irish, known to the Romans as the Scotti, launched swift seaborne attacks, plundering the western coasts. And from the east, there were already hints of what was to come. Bands of seaborne warriors, Saxons, had been raiding British shores since the late Roman period, testing defenses, taking what they could. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the old Roman-British aristocracy faced difficult choices. Some fortified their estates, building timber palisades around what had once been open, elegant villas. Others moved into defensible hilltops, repurposing ancient Iron Age hill forts. The countryside dotted itself once again with places of refuge. The people of Britain in this age lived between worlds. They could still walk on Roman roads, but grass crept between the paving stones. They could still see the great walls of Roman cities, but the watchtowers often stood empty. They could still pray in churches built in the Roman style, but the priests had fewer books, fewer links to the wider Christian world. This in-between time bred both fear and opportunity. Without Rome's bureaucracy, a skilled leader could rise quickly and fall just as fast. Alliances shifted with the seasons. A man who was your neighbor's ally in the spring might raid his herds in the autumn, and yet life for the majority of people, farmers, herders, artisans, was focused on survival, not politics. They rose with the sun, tended fields of barley and wheat, cared for sheep and cattle, fished in rivers and along the coasts. The tools they used were familiar, much like those of the centuries before Rome came. Life was hard, but not hopeless. It was into this fragile, fractured world that the first larger groups of Anglo-Saxon settlers would step. To some British leaders, they were a solution-strong fighters who could be hired to protect against northern and western raiders. To others, they were an unpredictable force, difficult to control once they established their own settlements. The ancient historian Gildas, writing in the 6th century, would later describe this period as a time of moral decline and divine punishment, casting the Saxon newcomers as a plague invited in by foolish leaders. His words are colored by anger and hindsight, but they hint at the tension that must have existed when these new peoples began to arrive in greater numbers. Picture it: a coastal village in eastern Britain. The tide is out, gulls wheel above the shallows. The people there still speak a mix of Latin and British Celtic, wear wool tunics belted at the waist, cook in pottery inherited from their grandparents. And then one morning, sails appear on the horizon, not a single raiding ship, but a cluster, heavy with families as well as warriors. Some will greet them cautiously, perhaps even warmly, remembering old alliances between Romans and Saxon mercenaries. Others will watch from a distance, suspicion in their eyes. The land is rich here, and newcomers bring change, and change is dangerous. Britain, before the Anglo-Saxons, was already a land on edge, a place where the old order was gone, and no new order had yet taken hold. It was a land in search of stability, and in that search, it would open its gates, willingly or not, to the peoples from across the sea. And soon, the island would no longer remember what it was like to live without them. By the time the migrations of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had turned from a trickle into a steady tide, the island of Britain had begun to feel different. Villages of timber-framed halls dotted the lowlands, often near rivers or along fertile coastal plains. The newcomers had cleared patches of forest, planted fields, and raised palisades to guard against both human and animal threats. But more than that, they were starting to think not just in terms of farms and families, but of territories. It didn't happen all at once. For years, these early Anglo-Saxon communities existed as small, independent units, clusters of extended families led by a local chief, bound together by kinship, loyalty, and the need to survive. But in a land where disputes were often settled by the strength of one's warband, the most successful leaders began to extend their influence beyond their own settlement. This was the age when petty kingdoms were born. The process was gradual. One chief might form an alliance with a neighboring settlement, sealed by marriage or a shared campaign against a rival. Over time, alliances grew into dominions. A single leader could command the loyalty of many villages, perhaps dozens of miles apart. And when that leader died, his sons, or sometimes ambitious rivals, would inherit not just land, but the network of oaths that held it together. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, a clearer pattern had emerged. The island, at least in its Anglo-Saxon-held regions, was dominated by 7 notable kingdoms, what later historians would call the Heptarchy. These were not permanent fixtures, nor were they equal in power. Their borders shifted with every war and marriage treaty, but their names would echo through the chronicles. Northumbria in the far north, forged from the union of Bernicia and Dara. Mercia in the heartland, straddling the river valleys of the Trent and Severn. Wessex in the south, spreading from the upper Thames down to the southern coast. Kent in the southeast, its rulers often among the first to deal with continental powers. East Anglia, encompassing the lands of the Angles in the east. Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons. Sussex, the realm of the South Saxons. Each had its own royal line, its own network of lords and warriors, its own ambitions. Northumbria, for instance, was a land of rugged hills, windswept coasts, and great halls overlooking the sea. Its kings could command fleets as well as armies, and its reach sometimes extended over the Picts to the north, or into the fertile valleys further south. Mercia was a different creature altogether, a kingdom of the Midlands, with easy access to river trade routes and fertile plains. It had no coastline, but it compensated by being a crossroads, able to strike in any direction. Wessex, farther south, was rich in farmland and positioned to influence the Channel trade. In later centuries, it would rise to unmatched prominence, but in these early days, it was one kingdom among several, sometimes overshadowed by its rivals. Kent, though smaller in land, had something the others did not: close ties to the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. Through trade and royal marriages, it acted as a cultural bridge, often the first to adopt ideas and goods from the continent. East Anglia, Essex, and Sussex were more vulnerable to coastal raids, but also more open to seaborne trade. Their kings commanded loyalty through both defense and the promise of spoils from overseas ventures. Life in these kingdoms was defined by loyalty, the comitatus bond between a king and his thanes, noble retainers. A king's hall was more than a political center. It was the heart of the realm. Here, warriors feasted on roasted meat and drank from horn cups, listening to poets recite tales of heroism. In return for protection and wealth, thanes pledged to fight, and if necessary, die for their lord. The structure of power was personal. Kingship was not yet about bureaucracy or written law codes, though those would come, but about charisma, reputation, and the ability to win victories. A king who lost too many battles, or who failed to reward his followers, could quickly find himself replaced by a more capable rival. But as the 7th century wore on, another layer began to settle over these kingdoms: diplomacy. Marriages between royal houses could knit alliances that might last a generation. Tribute payments could secure peace without a battle. Envoys and messengers became as important as warriors, carrying not just demands, but gifts: brooches of gilded silver, finely woven cloth, or even exotic goods brought from distant lands. And yet, for all the diplomacy, war was never far away. Borders were fluid, and the temptation to seize a neighbor's fertile fields was ever present. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of later writings, records year after year of raids, battles, and shifting allegiances. Imagine a spring morning in early Mercia. The frost has melted from the fields, the river runs high from winter rains, and a warband gathers at the king's hall. Spears lean against the walls, shields hang ready, and the air smells of oiled leather. The king has decided to march against a neighboring territory, perhaps in response to an insult, perhaps to reclaim land, perhaps simply because victory would bring wealth and renown. These campaigns were not grand medieval wars With vast armies, they were swift, brutal affairs. A few hundred men might be enough to decide the fate of a border region. Villages could change allegiance in a single season. Still, the Heptarchy was more than just a collection of warlords. Over time, these kingdoms developed customs, traditions, and even rudimentary laws that bound their people together. Disputes might be settled in a moot, a gathering where free men could speak. Compensation payments, wargold, were established to prevent endless blood feuds, setting a price on injuries and even lives, and gradually, identities began to form. A man from Northumbria might see himself as different from a man of Wessex, not just in dialect, but in the stories, customs, and loyalties that shaped his life. These identities were fragile, yes, but they were seeds that in time would grow into a sense of Englishness. The Heptarchy was never static. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell, and alliances broke like waves on the shore. But through this turbulence, something enduring was being forged. The first outlines of the political map that would, centuries later, become England. Yet, for all their power, these kingdoms were not alone on the island. The native Britons, descendants of the Romano-British, still held lands in the west and north. In Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Strathclyde, their own kingdoms endured, speaking their own languages, holding to their own traditions. Tensions simmered between these worlds, sometimes breaking into open conflict. The Heptarchy was only part of the story, but it was the part that would shape the island's destiny most profoundly. And in the next chapter of that story, we'll step inside those timber halls, into the smoke and firelight, to see how these kingdoms lived from day to day. For behind the clashing of spears and the sweep of armies, there was a quieter rhythm, the rhythm of everyday life, where the fate of kings mattered less than the harvest, the hearth, and the bonds between kin. If the Heptarchy gave shape to the political map of early Anglo-Saxon England, the Mead Hall gave shape to its heart. It was here, in the timbered glow of a long, firelit building, that the life of the community unfolded, where loyalties were sworn, victories celebrated, and stories passed from one generation to the next. Step with me into such a hall on a winter evening. The air outside is sharp and cold, the wind carrying the smell of wood smoke from the hearths of nearby houses. You push aside a heavy wool curtain at the doorway and enter a world of warmth and noise. The hall is long and narrow, built of stout oak beams, its roof high and steep to let smoke curl upward and escape through a hole at the top. Along the walls hang shields painted in bright colors, reds, blacks, yellows, the emblems of warriors who sit now at the benches beneath them. Spears rest in racks, their tips glinting in the firelight. Down the center of the hall, a long hearth blazes. Flames leap and dance, casting shifting shadows across the faces of those gathered. The heat is welcome, for the Anglo-Saxon winter is long and the darkness deep. The smell here is rich, a mix of roasting meat, spilt mead, and the tang of burning oak. The king or local lord sits on a raised platform at the far end, his high seat flanked by the most trusted of his thanes. His cloak is fastened with a brooch of silver, perhaps set with a garnet or amber. Around him, the air is thick with conversation, deep laughter, the clang of cups being set down, the low murmur of voices sharing news or gossip. The mead hall is more than a place to eat and drink. It is the physical embodiment of the comitatus, the bond between lord and warrior. Here, rewards are given. A warrior who has fought bravely might receive a finely worked sword, its hilt wound with silver wire. Another might be gifted a gold arm ring, heavy on the wrist, a visible token of honor. These gifts are not merely payment. They are symbols of trust and loyalty, binding the receiver to the giver in mutual obligation. Meals in the hall are hearty but simple. Bread made from barley or wheat, cheese from goat or cow's milk, smoked fish, and joints of pork or beef roasted on spits over the fire. Mead, the honey-based drink for which the hall is named, is served in horn cups, its sweetness warming the belly. Ale, too, is common, brewed in great vats in the village. While the warriors eat, a scop, a poet and singer, may rise to perform. His voice, steady and rhythmic, weaves tales of great battles, of heroes long dead, of voyages across stormy seas. The scop does more than entertain. He keeps the memory of the people alive, shaping how they understand their past. In a world without widespread writing, such performances are the library, the archive, the national epic, all at once. Beyond the hall, life is marked by the turning of the seasons. The Anglo-Saxon year is one of labor and cycles, deeply tied to the land. In spring, fields are plowed with oxen, seeds sown by hand. Summer brings the tending of crops and the shearing of sheep, whose wool will be spun and woven through the long months of cold. Autumn is harvest time, when every able hand is needed to bring in the grain before frost. Winter is the season of slaughtering livestock. Those animals not needed for breeding are killed, so their meat can be salted, smoked, or dried to last through the lean months. Most people live in small villages of a dozen or so houses, built of timber with thatched roofs. The floors are packed earth, sometimes with a sunken hearth in the center. Chickens scratch in the yard, pigs root in the nearby woods. Children help with chores from an early age, fetching water, gathering firewood, tending the animals. Socially, Anglo-Saxon society is divided into clear ranks. At the top are the kings and their ealdormen, who govern large territories. Beneath them are the thanes, warriors of noble status who hold land in return for service. Below these are the ceorls, free peasants who work their own small plots of land. And at the bottom, the thralls' slaves, often taken in war or born into servitude. Slavery is a grim reality of the age, woven into the economy and social order. Women's roles are varied and important. While most do not fight in battle, they are the keepers of the household, the managers of food, clothing, and supplies. Some women of high status wield significant political influence, especially through marriage alliances, or as the heads of estates when their husbands are away. They can own land, manage servants, and even commission religious or artistic works. Religion in this early stage of the Anglo-Saxon period still bears the marks of the old gods. Woden, Thunor, Tiw. Their names are spoken in oaths, their favor sought before battle. Sacred groves, springs, and burial mounds are places of reverence. Seasonal festivals mark key points in the agricultural year. The blessing of fields in spring, the burning of fires at midwinter. Christianity has not yet reached deeply into most of these halls, though in some places its symbols and rituals are beginning to mingle with the old ways. Justice is both personal and communal. If a man is wronged, his kin are expected to seek redress, either through agreed compensation, known as wergild, or through a feud. The moot, or assembly of free men, is a vital institution where disputes are heard, fines set, and community decisions made. And yet, for all the harshness of the age, there is beauty here too. The Anglo-Saxons are skilled craftsmen, working gold, silver, and bronze into intricate designs of knots and beasts. Their brooches and belt fittings are both functional and works of art. They carve patterns into the hilts of swords, inscribe runes onto bone and wood, weave textiles with complex, colorful patterns. The hall is where all of these threads meet: politics, economy, art, faith, and the bonds of loyalty. By day, it may be quiet, with only the sound of servants tending the fire or repairing the benches. By night, when the warriors gather and the scop sings, it becomes the living heart of the kingdom, beating in time with the steps of the dancers, the rhythm of the poetry, and the deep, satisfied hum of men and women warmed by food, drink, and the nearness of friends. Still, beyond the warmth of the hall lies a colder truth. This is a world always on the edge of violence. Tomorrow, the king may call for his warriors to march. The hall may be empty, its benches cold, while those same men face spears and arrows on some distant field. And in that knowledge lies the quiet intensity of the Anglo-Saxon night, a sense that the bonds sworn here, under the glow of the fire, may be tested by dawn. For the mead hall is both a refuge and a mustering place, and soon the old gods will find themselves sharing it with new ones, carried across the sea by strangers in black robes. Before the first missionaries stepped onto Britain's shores with their books and crosses, the Anglo-Saxons lived under the gaze of older, wilder gods. These deities were not distant, abstract figures. They walked in the wind, the storm, the harvest, the frost. They lived in the strength of the oak, in the roar of the sea, in the fierce courage of a warrior before battle. The Anglo-Saxon pantheon was not recorded in neat lists, nor written down in the manner of the Greeks and Romans. Instead, it lived in the spoken word, in the memories of scops, in the chants of rituals carried out at sacred sites. Still, from later writings, place names, and the threads of old poetry, we can catch glimpses of these gods and the roles they played. Foremost among them was Woden, wise, one-eyed, the wanderer, the war god, and the giver of kingship. To invoke Woden was to ask for cunning in battle and strength in leadership. Kings often claimed descent from him, not just as a way of legitimizing power, but as a statement of their divine right to rule. Then there was Thunor, the thunderer, wielder of the great hammer, protector of the common folk. Thunor's favor was sought in times of danger, especially when storms threatened crops or enemies loomed on the horizon. His hammer was a sign of both destruction and protection, a reminder that in chaos there is also safety for those under his care. Tiw, god of war and justice, was a more measured figure, associated with honor, courage, and the keeping of oaths. It is from him that we inherit the name for Tuesday, Tuesday. There were others. Frigg, associated with foreknowledge and weaving the fates. Eoster, the goddess of the dawn and spring, whose festival may echo faintly in our modern Easter. And local spirits of place, river gods, tree spirits, ancestral shades, whose presence was felt in the daily rhythms of life. The Anglo-Saxon religious world was deeply tied to the land. Sacred groves, springs, hills, and stones served as places of worship. Here, offerings might be made, a libation of mead poured onto the earth, a finely crafted weapon laid in the waters, a sacrifice of animals to feed both the people and the gods. Fire was a central element in many rituals, its light and warmth, a living force against the darkness of the world. These ceremonies were rarely public spectacles for thousands. They were intimate affairs, often limited to the community or clan. The Godi or Jidja, the priest or priestess, would lead the rites, chanting in the old tongue, invoking the god's presence. The people would gather in a circle, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes bearing torches, and speak words that had been said for generations. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, each one blending practical necessity with spiritual meaning. Midwinter brought Modronit, Mother's Night, a time of honoring female ancestors and the spirits who guarded the hearth. The lengthening days of spring carried rites to bless the fields, ensuring fertile soil and strong harvests. Summer's height brought celebrations of strength and community, while autumn was a time of thanks and preparation for the lean months ahead. Death was not an end, but a passage. The burial customs of the Anglo-Saxons tell us much about their beliefs. Some were laid in ship burials, great vessels hauled onto land, filled with weapons, armor, treasures, food, and drink, then covered in earth to create a mound. Others were cremated, their ashes placed in urns decorated with runes or animal motifs. The grave goods were not sentimental trinkets, They were practical provisions for the journey to the afterlife, a place the poets called Niuxnawing, a kind of paradise meadow. In these burial mounds and artifacts, we see a faith rooted in reciprocity. Give to the gods, honor the ancestors, and you will receive protection and prosperity in return. The gods were not omnipotent, moral overseers. They were powerful beings who could be persuaded, honored, and if offended, feared. The runes themselves were sacred symbols, not just letters. Each carried a name and a meaning. Fi for wealth, Uras for strength, Tiwas for justice. To carve a rune into wood or stone was to make a mark, not just in language, but in the invisible world. Runes might be inscribed on weapons to grant victory, on amulets to protect a child, or on a threshold to keep out evil. Yet for all its mystery, Anglo-Saxon paganism was woven into the ordinary. A farmer might bless his plow in Woden's name before the first furrow was cut. A mother might hang a charm invoking Frigg over a child's bed. A warrior might whisper a prayer to Thunner as he tightened the straps of his helmet. This faith was not separate from daily life. It was daily life, as constant as the seasons, as present as the wind over the fields. And then, like the first faint glimmer of dawn, another faith began to appear on the horizon. From across the channel came men in black robes, speaking of a single God and his Son who had walked the earth. They brought books, not runes, stone churches, not sacred groves. They spoke of eternal salvation, of sin and forgiveness. At first, these two worlds existed side by side. Some kings and nobles saw advantage in aligning with the Christians, especially given the political connections it brought to the powerful kingdoms of Gaul and beyond. Others clung to the old gods, wary of abandoning the deities who had guarded their people for generations. It would not be an easy or swift change. In many places, the transition from pagan to Christian was gradual, more a layering of belief than a replacement. Festivals once dedicated to Easter might be reinterpreted in Christian terms. Sacred groves might become the sites of churches. Old gods might linger in charms and place names long after their formal worship had ceased. The old faith did not vanish overnight, nor, in truth, did it ever fully vanish. Its echoes can still be heard in the days of the week, in the names of hills and rivers, in the quiet reverence for certain times of year. But in the centuries to come, the cross would rise where once the hammer had hung. The halls of kings would hear psalms instead of pagan chants. And with this change would come a new kind of unity, one that could bind the scattered kingdoms in ways even Woden himself might not have foreseen. Yet before the cross took root, the seeds had to be planted. And in the next part of our story, we will watch as a Roman monk named Augustine steps ashore in Kent, bringing with him a message that would change Britain forever. It is the spring of the year 597. The sea is restless under a pale sky, and on the eastern coast of Kent, the people gather to watch a strange procession making landfall. The ships that glide toward shore are not the sleek, narrow longboats of raiders, nor the heavy merchant vessels that sometimes cross the channel. These are smaller craft, bearing men in simple black robes, their heads tonsured, the front shaven and the back grown long in the Roman style. They carry no weapons. Instead, they hold aloft a silver cross, its figure of Christ catching what little sunlight breaks through the clouds. At their head is a man named Augustine, not yet Saint Augustine of Canterbury, but a monk of the Benedictine order, sent by Pope Gregory the Great from the city of Rome itself. His mission is bold and uncertain: to bring the gospel of Christ to the Anglo-Saxon people, starting with the kingdom of Kent. Why Kent? The choice is not random. King Ethelbert of Kent has a queen, Bertha, who is already a Christian. She is a Frankish princess from across the Channel, and her marriage to Ethelbert was sealed with the understanding that she might keep her faith and her own small chapel. It is likely through her influence that the king has agreed to at least hear Augustine's message. When Augustine and his companions step onto the shore, they are escorted to the king, who receives them in the open air, perhaps to show that the gods of the old ways can still see and judge what passes. Ethelbert listens to the monk's words through an interpreter, for Latin is still the language of the church, and Old English is the language of the king. Augustine speaks of one God, creator of heaven and earth, and of his Son Jesus Christ, who offers eternal life. The king is cautious. He tells Augustine that his message is fair enough, and that he will allow him to preach and teach, but he himself will not yet convert. Still, he grants Augustine land in Canterbury and permission to establish a church. It is here that Augustine plants the seeds of the new faith. In time, perhaps swayed by his queen, perhaps by the example of the monks, Ethelbert himself accepts baptism. With the king's conversion, many of his thanes follow, for in Anglo-Saxon society, the faith of the ruler often sets the faith of the people. To honor the king is to honor his God. But the process is not as simple as one ceremony. Pagan temples do not vanish overnight. Augustine, on Pope Gregory's advice, does not destroy them outright, but repurposes them. The old sacred sites become churches. The festivals dedicated to the gods are transformed into Christian holy days. Where the people once brought offerings to Thunder, they might now light candles before a crucifix. The missionary's task is as much about adaptation as persuasion. They learn the rhythms of the Anglo-Saxon year, the festivals of harvest and solstice, and weave Christian meaning into them. They preach not only in halls, but in marketplaces and at moots, where the free men gather to decide disputes. At the same time, they bring with them the treasures of literacy. The Latin alphabet begins to replace the old runes in official use. The monasteries they establish become centers of learning, where the sons of nobles and sometimes gifted commoners can learn to read and write, skills that open doors to diplomacy and record keeping. Conversion spreads outward from Kent like ripples in a pond. Northumbria receives the faith through its ties to Kent and through Irish missionaries from the West, who bring a different flavor of Christianity, shaped by the monastic traditions of Iona and Lindisfarne. In Mercia and Wessex, the process is slower, sometimes tied to the fortunes of war. A victorious Christian king may demand baptism from a defeated pagan ruler. A pagan king who defeats a Christian rival may turn back to the old gods. It is not always peaceful. There are stories of missionaries driven out, of churches burned by those who see them as threats to the old order. And there are tales of kings who accept baptism, but still, in times of crisis, offer sacrifice to Woden or Thunner, not out of loyalty, but out of caution. For the common folk, the change is gradual and layered. The words of the Mass are in Latin, a language most do not understand, but the images and symbols are powerful. The figure of Christ on the cross, the stories of saints and martyrs, the ringing of bells. Baptism is a visible and communal act. Burial in consecrated ground becomes a mark of belonging. The Church also brings a new moral framework. Concepts of sin, repentance, and charity begin to mingle with the older Germanic codes of honor and vengeance. The world system remains, but the Church encourages forgiveness and reconciliation, offering sanctuary to those in danger of blood feud. And yet, the old ways do not vanish. For generations, charms invoking both Christ and pagan gods circulate together. Farmers might attend Mass on Sunday and still bless their plows in the name of Woden. Amulets carved with runes are worn alongside crosses. The landscape itself bears witness to this blending. Place names with elements like Thorpe or Wednesfield, Woden's Field sit alongside new names like St. Albans or St. Peter's on the Wall. By the early 7th century, Christianity is no longer just a foreign novelty. It is becoming part of the political and cultural fabric of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Monasteries grow in influence, not only as spiritual centers, but as economic and political hubs. Kings sponsor the building of churches to display their piety and cement alliances with the powerful bishops who now advise them. Still, this new faith brings with it attention. The loyalty once sworn only to one's kin and Lord is now also sworn to a universal God. The hall remains the heart of the community, but the church begins to stand beside it, offering a different kind of gathering, a different vision of what it means to live well. The cross has arrived, and with it comes not only a change in worship, but a change in identity. To be Christian is to be part of a larger world, one that stretches far beyond the North Sea, beyond the Channel, all the way to Rome and Jerusalem. And yet, this connection to the wider Christian world will bring Britain into currents of power and conflict it has never faced before. For now, the faith is growing, its roots deepening in Kent and spreading north and west. But soon, those roots will bear fruit in another form. The flowering of art, poetry, and learning that will give us some of the most beautiful creations of the Anglo-Saxon age. And in the next part of our story, we will open those books and step into the scriptoriums, where quills scratch and the light of learning shines against the dark. In the dim glow of a tallow candle, the scratch of a quill on vellum is the only sound. Outside, the wind presses against the wooden shutters, and beyond the monastery walls, the land lies in deep night. Inside, however, a different kind of light burns, not from the sun or moon, but from the quiet labor of men bent over manuscripts, shaping words that will outlive them by centuries. The Christian faith had brought to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms not only new beliefs, but new tools for memory. Before the coming of the missionaries, stories, laws, and histories had lived in the mouths of poets and the minds of elders. Now they began to live also in books. These books were not books as we know them. No printed pages bound neatly between covers. They were painstakingly made objects, written on vellum scraped from the hides of calves or sheep, each page smoothed and prepared for the quill. The ink was brewed from oak galls, its dark strokes holding firm against time. In the scriptorium, the air was cool and heavy with the smell of parchment. Monks sat at long wooden desks, their backs often aching, their eyes straining in the half-light. They copied texts in Latin, the language of the church and of learning. But soon, something remarkable happened. The English tongue, once only spoken and sung, began to find its way onto these sacred pages. The earliest Anglo-Saxon writing we have is a blend of the old and the new. There are charters, formal grants of land, carefully recorded to secure the legal claims of monasteries and noble patrons. There are glosses, where a monk might write an old English explanation in the margins of a Latin text. There are translations, most famously those ordered by King Alfred, the great 2 centuries later, but whose roots began in this early impulse to make knowledge accessible. But literature is not born from law alone. In the same centuries that saw the growth of written records, the old oral tradition persisted and intertwined with the written word. Poets, still called scops in Old English, began to see their verses recorded. Epic tales like Beowulf, though likely composed long before, were finally committed to writing in these years. Imagine, if you will, the world of Beowulf, the smoky warmth of the mead hall, the thud of spear butts on the floor, the clang of gold bracelets against the arm of a lord, and the deep, resonant voice of the poet recounting the deeds of heroes. These were stories of courage, loyalty, and fate, values the Anglo-Saxons held dear. But they were also colored now by the Christian moral framework. The heroes might still call upon Weird, the mysterious force of fate, yet the poet might also speak of God's providence. The monasteries themselves became cultural crossroads. From Ireland came illuminated manuscripts rich with spirals, interlacing patterns, and bright pigments. From Rome came orderly script and theological treatises. The Anglo-Saxons absorbed these influences and made them their own. One of the greatest centers of this new literary flowering was Lindisfarne, the holy island off the coast of Northumbria. Here, in the early 8th century, the monks produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, a masterpiece of art and devotion. Its Latin text of the 4 Gospels is written in a hand so precise it looks printed, and between the lines, later scribes added an Old English translation. The earliest known version of the Gospels in the English language. The pages gleam with gold, deep blues, and fiery reds. The designs a fusion of Celtic, Germanic, and Mediterranean styles. But not all was serene. The monks wrote and painted in a world that could turn violent without warning. Viking raids had not yet reached their peak in this period, but danger was never far away. Even so, the desire to preserve words and ideas was stronger than fear. Another form of early writing was the chronicle, a year-by-year record of events. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, begun in the late 9th century, but drawing on earlier sources, would eventually preserve the political and military history of the kingdoms in remarkable detail. These records were not purely objective. They reflected the perspectives and loyalties of those who wrote them. A monk in Wessex might portray its kings as divinely favored, while a northern scribe might linger on the glories of Northumbria. Still, they give us an unparalleled window into the age. Alongside the chronicles and epics were religious poems like the Dream of the Rood, in which the cross itself speaks, recounting the crucifixion in the voice of a loyal retainer to his Lord. It is a striking blend of Christian devotion and warrior ethos, casting Christ not as a passive sufferer, but as a heroic figure who mounts the cross like a battlefield. The language in these works is rich with compound words, kennings, that carry layers of meaning. The sea might be called the whale road, a ship, a wave floater, the body, the bone house. These images make the verses vivid, but they also reflect a worldview in which nature, human life, and the divine are deeply interwoven. The very act of writing in Old English was, in its way, a statement of identity. Latin might connect the Anglo-Saxons to the great Christian world, but English bound them to their own land, their own ancestors, their own stories. And so, in these quiet rooms where candles burned low, the roots of English literature took hold. Every stroke of the quill was an act of preservation against the forgetting that time demands. The scribe who copied a gospel or a poem could not know that 1,000 years later, people would still read those words. Yet, perhaps, some part of him hoped. This age of quills and chronicles was not simply about recording the present. It was about building a bridge between past and future. The old songs of the pagan hall, the new faith of the Christian altar, the laws of the king, the visions of poets. All were finding a place in ink and vellum. But just as this light of learning was beginning to glow brighter, shadows began to gather on the horizon. From across the northern seas came ships of a different kind, long, narrow, and deadly swift, and in their prows stood warriors with axes and spears, men who cared nothing for the cross or the quill. In the next chapter of our journey, we will hear the sound of their oars and the crash of their landings. The Vikings are coming. It began, as so many storms do, with a single dark cloud on the horizon. The year was 793. On the small, wind-swept island of Lindisfarne, monks moved quietly about their morning prayers. The tide rose and fell. The seabirds cried. The smell of salt and seaweed drifted on the wind. It must have seemed like any other day in their life of devotion. But that morning, the horizon to the east held something strange, narrow ships with high, curving prows, gliding over the waves like creatures born of both wood and water. These were not the broad trading vessels of merchants from Phrygia or Francia. These were longships, built for speed, with shallow hulls that could slip up rivers as easily as they crossed the open sea. Their prows were carved into the heads of dragons and serpents. Their shields hung in bright rows along the gunwales. And on board were men, tall, broad-shouldered, armed with axes and spears, their faces shadowed by helmets of iron or leather. The first strike came with terrifying speed. The longships beached on the sand, and the raiders poured ashore. The monks, unarmed and unprepared, had no defense against them. The attackers cut down those who resisted, stripped the church of its treasures, gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, sacred books, and left the island burning. Word of the raid spread quickly, carried by frightened messengers across the north. To the Anglo-Saxons, the attack on Lindisfarne was more than just a robbery. It was an assault on the heart of their faith, a violation of a place they believed under God's protection. Some said it was a sign of God's anger, a punishment for sins unrepented. Others simply saw it as proof that a new and terrible enemy had arrived. The Vikings, for that is what these raiders were, seafarers from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, did not come only once. They returned year after year to monasteries and towns along the coast, Holy Island, Jarrow, Iona. All felt the bite of their blades. Their raids followed a cruel rhythm, striking in spring or summer when the seas were calmer, then vanishing back across the waves with their plunder. They targeted monasteries not only because they were rich in treasure, but because they were undefended. Monks might pray, but they did not fight. And yet, the Vikings were not only destroyers. Some came to trade, bringing amber, furs, and walrus ivory in exchange for silver and cloth. Others settled, especially in the later 9th century, when larger Viking forces, the so-called Great Heathen Army, arrived not just to raid, but to conquer. This army, which landed in East Anglia in 865, was far larger and more organized than the raiding bands of earlier years. Led by figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, it moved systematically across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell first, its kings slain or driven out. East Anglia was next, its ruler martyred for refusing to renounce his faith. Mercia resisted for a time, but even it was forced into uneasy treaties. The Vikings were skilled warriors, but their advantage lay also in their mobility. They could strike suddenly from rivers and retreat before a larger force could be gathered. Their ships carried them deep inland, and their knowledge of the sea routes made them unpredictable foes. For the Anglo-Saxons, this was an age of fear and resilience. Villages learned to hide their food and valuables. Watchmen stood on cliffs to look for sails. Kings and ealdormen raised feuds, local militias, to respond to attacks, though these were often too slow to prevent a raid. The monasteries, once centers of learning and peace, had to adapt or perish. Some fortified their grounds, others moved their treasures to hidden places. The famous Book of Kells, though Irish in origin, is thought by some to have been moved inland to escape Viking raids, its brilliant pages preserved by flight rather than force. And yet, even in the shadow of the longships, life went on. Fields were still plowed, markets still held, children still born. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms did not vanish. They bent under the storm, but they did not break. One of the greatest figures to rise in this dark time was Alfred of Wessex, later called Alfred the Great. Though his story belongs fully to another chapter, it was during these years of Viking pressure that his kingdom became a rallying point for resistance. Alfred understood the threat the Vikings posed, not just to his land, but to the entire Anglo-Saxon way of life. But Alfred's time was still to come. In these early years of the Viking Age, the balance seemed uncertain. The Danes controlled large swaths of the north and east. Many Anglo-Saxon rulers had been killed, their thrones taken by foreign lords. The old boundaries of the kingdoms were shifting, and with them, the very identity of the land. Still, the Anglo-Saxons did not see themselves only as victims. They told stories of battles won, of heroes who faced the raiders with sword and shield. Songs were sung of the courage of local lords, of the defiance of villages that refused to yield. These tales, like the sagas of the Vikings themselves, kept alive the sense of who they were. And there was a strange irony to this age of violence. It brought the Anglo-Saxons into closer contact with the wider world. The Vikings traded as well as raided, carrying goods and ideas across the North Sea. In some places, they intermarried with local families, their children growing up between two cultures. Over time, the Danelaw, the territory under Viking law, would leave its own mark on English speech, customs, and place names. For now, though, the shadow of the longship loomed. A village might go to sleep under the quiet of the summer night and wake to the shout of oarsmen and the clash of steel. Even inland towns were not safe, for the rivers were open roads to the heart of the land. It was an age of uncertainty, but also of endurance. The Anglo-Saxons had survived the collapse of Rome, the arrival of their own ancestors from across the sea, and the long wars between their kingdoms. Now they would face this new challenge, and in the crucible of that struggle, leaders would emerge, alliances would form, and a new chapter in the history of England would be forged. And in our next part, we will step into that crucible and meet the man who would turn the tide, Alfred of Wessex, the unlikely king who became the great defender of his people. The story of Alfred begins not in the blaze of battle, but in the quiet halls of a royal court, far from the smell of salt and the cry of Viking horns. He was born in 849 in the kingdom of Wessex, a land of rolling hills, chalk downs, and winding rivers, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf. In those days, no one expected the boy to wear a crown. He had older brothers, each standing before him in the line of succession. Yet fate, or perhaps weird, has its own designs. As a child, Alfred was not famed for his strength in arms, but for his mind. He traveled to Rome when he was only 6, escorted by his father, and was received by the Pope himself. The boy saw the marble streets, the towering churches, and the ancient relics of an empire long gone. A vision that would shape his life. While most boys of noble blood learned the sword first, Alfred was drawn to books, to the stories of past kings, and the wisdom of holy men. But peace was not to be his world. By the time Alfred reached manhood, the Viking threat had grown into a storm that battered all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His own brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, each took their turn as king, each facing the relentless raids of the Danes, and one by one, Alfred would stand beside them in battle. In 871, the storm broke over Wessex with full force. The great heathen army, fresh from victories in the north, descended southward. King Ethelred and Alfred met them in a series of battles, some won, some lost, until Ethelred fell ill and died, leaving the crown to Alfred. He was only 21. Imagine the weight of that moment, a young king, inheriting not a kingdom at peace, but one on the brink of collapse. The Danes controlled much of England already. Their war bands roamed freely, their leaders demanding tribute, their settlements spreading in the Danelaw. Many might have surrendered. Alfred did not. In the first years of his reign, Alfred fought and often lost. The Danes pushed deep into Wessex. In 878, under the leadership of Guthrum, they struck in the dead of winter, when campaigning was rare. They drove Alfred into the marshlands of Somerset, forcing him into hiding with only a small band of loyal followers. It is here that one of the most famous tales of Alfred is set, the story of the burnt cakes. Legend has it that, while sheltering in the hut of a peasant woman, Alfred was asked to watch her loaves as they baked. distracted by thoughts of his kingdom and his enemies, he let them burn. The woman scolded him fiercely, not knowing she was speaking to her king. Whether true or not, the story endures because it shows Alfred not as an untouchable figure of marble, but as a man tired, distracted, and yet still enduring. From the marshes, Alfred did not vanish. He rebuilt. He sent messengers to rally his forces. He gathered men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, calling on their loyalty and their fear of what would come if they did not fight. In the spring of that same year, he met the Danes at Edington. The battle was fierce, shield walls crashing against each other, the air filled with the clash of iron and the cries of the wounded. But at Edington, Alfred won. Guthrum was forced to retreat, and soon after he agreed to a peace. More than that, he accepted baptism, with Alfred as his godfather, and withdrew to East Anglia. It was not the end of Viking incursions, but it was a turning point. Alfred understood that victory in a single battle was not enough. He needed to make Wessex unbreakable. His reforms began with defense. He ordered the building of fortified towns, burhs, placed strategically across his kingdom, so that no settlement would be more than a day's march from refuge. These burhs were more than military strongholds. They became centers of trade and administration, strengthening the kingdom in peace as well as war. He reorganized the army, ensuring that at any given time, part of it was in the field, while another part was at home, tending the land. This rotating service meant that Wessex could maintain its defense without exhausting its people. Alfred also turned his attention to the sea. He commissioned the building of ships larger and swifter than those of the Danes, giving birth to what some call the first English navy. The longships might have brought terror to the coasts, but Alfred intended to answer them in kind. Yet Alfred was more than a war leader. He was a builder of culture. Troubled by the decline of learning that the wars had brought, he invited scholars from across the Christian world to his court. He translated important works into Old English himself, texts like Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, so that they might be read by those who did not know Latin. He saw learning not as a luxury, but as a shield against ignorance and division. In his charters and his laws, we see a mind deeply concerned with justice. He sought to blend the old customs of his people with Christian morality, producing a legal code that reflected both. He was not a king who ruled by fear alone, but one who believed in the binding power of law and shared identity. By the end of his reign, Wessex stood firm, its borders secure, its people better defended than they had been in living memory. The Danes still held much of the north and east, but the dream of an England united under one rule was no longer impossible. Alfred died in 899 at the age of 50. He had reigned for nearly 30 years, years of war, rebuilding, and renewal. In the centuries that followed, his name would be spoken with reverence. Only one English monarch would ever be called the Great, and it was Alfred, He left behind not only a stronger Wessex, but a vision of a land where learning and law walked hand in hand with courage and arms, a vision his descendants would take up, carrying the fight to unite the kingdoms into one realm. But as we shall see, that road would not be smooth. For even after Alfred, the Vikings had not vanished. The struggle for England was far from over. In our next part, we'll watch as Alfred's heirs step into his shadow, inheriting both his dream and his enemies, and the wars for England continue. When Alfred the Great died in 899, the land did not suddenly fall silent. The bars he had built still stood, their wooden palisades weathered but strong. The rivers still carried merchant boats, and occasionally the black-prowed ships of raiders. His laws and translations remained, as did his vision of an England more than just a patchwork of kingdoms. But vision alone is a fragile thing. It needs hands to shape it, to carry it forward. And that task fell first to Alfred's son, Edward, and to those who would fight alongside him. Edward, later called Edward the Elder, inherited not only Wessex, but also his father's burden. The Vikings still held the Danelaw, the north and east under their rule, and alliances between Danes and certain Anglo-Saxon nobles could turn the balance of power in an instant. Where Alfred had been tempered by years of defense and survival, Edward came to the throne at a moment when offense, the push outward, was both possible and dangerous. Edward was not alone in this task. His sister, Ethelfled, stands among the most remarkable figures of this age. Married to the ruler of Mercia, she became known as the Lady of the Mercians, and when her husband fell ill, she effectively ruled the kingdom. Like her father, she saw the value of bars, and she fortified towns across Mercia, creating a network of defenses that could answer Viking raids with swift retaliation. The siblings worked in quiet, deliberate coordination. Step by step, they tightened their grip on the borderlands between Wessex, Mercia, and the Danelaw. Sometimes this meant open war campaigns to seize towns like Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham. And sometimes it meant forging treaties, coaxing wavering lords into their orbit. The reconquest of territory was not simply about swords and sieges. Each captured town had to be integrated, its defenses repaired, its markets reopened, its people, often a mix of Anglo-Saxon and Danish, brought under new governance. Coins were minted bearing Edward's image, a signal to friend and foe alike that this was now his land. By 918, Ethelfled had achieved something extraordinary: the loyalty of much of Mercia and the capture of key Viking strongholds. That same year, her death came suddenly, a blow to Edward and to the cause they shared. Yet, in her absence, Edward moved quickly, absorbing Mercia into his rule, something that might have caused resentment had it not been for the shared goal of resisting the Danes. The tide was turning. Edward pressed northward, and by the end of his reign, he controlled almost all of England south of the Humber. His reign was one of consolidation, of building upon the foundations Alfred had laid, and though it lacked the single dramatic moment of a battle like Edington, it was no less decisive in the shaping of England's future. After Edward's death in 924, the crown passed briefly to his son Alfred, and then to another son, Aethelstan, a man who would push Alfred's dream to its furthest extent. Aethelstan had been raised partly in Mercia, under the watchful care of his aunt Aethelfled. He grew up seeing firsthand the fragile balance between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Viking lands. When Aethelstan became king in 924, he faced challenges not only from the north, but from within. Some in Wessex doubted his claim. Others in Mercia feared losing their distinct identity under a united crown. Aethelstan addressed both with a mix of diplomacy and force. He was quick to reward loyalty, but swifter still to put down rebellion. His ambitions went beyond defense. He launched campaigns deep into Viking territory, striking at York, a city that had long been a center of Norse power in England. He forged alliances with rulers in Scotland and Wales, using marriage and diplomacy to bind them closer, or at least to keep them from aiding his enemies. By the 930s, Aethelstan had achieved what no king before him had: the submission of all the kingdoms of England under his rule. His authority reached from the Channel to the borders of Scotland. He minted coins that simply bore the legend King of the English, a title both new and bold. And yet, unity did not come without resistance. In 937, a coalition of forces, Scots, Vikings from Dublin, and Britons from Strathclyde, challenged Aethelstan's rule. The confrontation came at the Battle of Brunanbar, a clash so fierce that it entered the annals of history and poetry alike. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle praises it as a great victory, one that secured England's borders for a generation. But as with all victories in this age, its permanence was fragile. Aethelstan died in 939 without an heir, and the kingdom he had forged began to fray. The Vikings of York reasserted their independence, and the work of unification had to be begun again by his successors. Still, what Alfred had envisioned, Edward had advanced, and Aethelstan had achieved. The idea of a single England had taken root. Even when the political map shifted, the memory of what had been possible remained, guiding the kings who followed. This period was also one of cultural blending. The Danelaw had not been erased. Its people lived on under English rule, bringing with them Norse customs, words, and place names. Markets in former Viking towns traded goods from across the North Sea. Laws and governance adapted, weaving together strands from both traditions. The road to unification was not a straight march, but a weaving path, one that moved forward, then back, then forward again, and it was about to face one of its greatest reversals. For beyond the horizon, In the cold halls of Scandinavia, a new generation of ambitious rulers was rising. Their gaze would fall once more upon England, and their fleets would set sail, bringing with them the weight of a renewed invasion. In our next part, we will witness the return of the Viking kings and the fierce struggle that would test whether the united England could endure. The death of Ethelstan in 939 marked the end of a rare, shining moment, a united England under one crown. But as quickly as such unity had been forged, it began to loosen. The North, never fully tamed, slipped back into Viking hands. York, the jewel of the Danelaw, welcomed a Norse king once more. It was as if the old lines on the map, the ones Alfred had fought to erase, reappeared like ink bleeding through worn parchment. This time, the threat came not just from scattered war bands or opportunistic jarls, but from Viking kings with dynasties of their own. Across the North Sea, in the cold courts of Norway and Denmark, a new generation had grown up on tales of their fathers' raids. They had inherited more than swords and ships. They had inherited ambition. One of the first to seize the opportunity was Olaf Guthfrithson, a Norse king from Dublin. In 939, almost as soon as Ethelstan's body was laid to rest, Olaf crossed the Irish Sea and took York. His arrival was not met with resistance, but with support from many in the north, who saw in him a ruler of their own blood and tongue. King Edmund, Ethelstan's half-brother, inherited this crisis. Young and untested, Edmund fought to reclaim the north, launching campaigns to push the Norse out of Mercia and back into the Danelaw. His efforts were partly successful, but the Norse kings proved slippery opponents. Alliances shifted like the tide. Victories were followed by uneasy treaties. The Viking kings did not come only from Ireland. Denmark, too, was stirring. By the mid-10th century, the Danish monarchy was becoming more centralized, more capable of projecting power overseas. Figures like Harold Bluetooth, remembered in legend for uniting Denmark and Norway, kept a close eye on England, both as a potential prize and as a land rich in tribute. For the Anglo-Saxon kings, this meant an almost constant state of readiness. Fortresses had to be maintained, fleets kept seaworthy, and the Fiad, the part-time citizen army, drilled and summoned at short notice. Trade routes needed protection, for it was not just armies that crossed the sea, but merchants and their goods. The returning Vikings were no longer simply raiders. Many sought to rule, to claim England as part of a wider North Sea empire, and in this new era, war took on a different shape. It was not always about sacking monasteries and burning villages. It was about sieges of fortified towns, naval blockades, and political marriages meant to bind former enemies together. One of the most famous of these alliances came in the reign of King Edgar, remembered later as Edgar the Peaceful. He ruled from 959 to 975, and during his reign, the Viking threat was for a time held at bay not by force of arms, but through diplomacy. Edgar recognized the Norse rulers in the north. So long as they acknowledged his overlordship, tribute was paid, hostages exchanged, and for 2 decades, the coasts of England were largely free from great raids. But peace in this age was always brittle. After Edgar's death, the crown passed to his young son Edward, later called Edward the Martyr. His reign was short and turbulent, ending with his murder in 978, a killing that many saw as an act of political intrigue within the English court itself. His half-brother, Ethelred, then took the throne. Ethelred was only about 12 years old when he became king, and though he would reign for decades, his time on the throne would be marked by one of the most relentless periods of Viking aggression in English history. It was in Ethelred's day that the term Danegeld, literally Dane payment, became infamous. The Danes had returned in force, their longships landing not just in the north, but along the southern and eastern coasts. The scale of these attacks was staggering. They were no longer just seasonal raids, but full campaigns lasting years. Facing enemies who seemed impossible to defeat outright, Ethelred's government began paying them vast sums of silver to leave, a strategy meant to buy peace, but which often had the opposite effect. The more gold and silver the Danes received, the more they came to see England as a land worth returning to. One of the most feared leaders of this period was Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Tall, fierce, and driven, Sweyn saw England not as a place to raid, but as a realm to conquer outright. He built alliances with other Viking leaders, using both force and shrewd bargaining to expand his influence. In 1002, in an act of desperation and fear, Ethelred ordered what became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, a coordinated killing of Danes living in England, including women and children. The intent was to eliminate potential collaborators in future invasions. The result was to enrage Sweyn Forkbeard, whose own sister was said to have been among the dead. From that moment, Sweyn's war against England took on a personal and unrelenting character. Raids became invasions. Invasions became occupation. By 1013, Sweyn had forced Ethelred into exile in Normandy, and for the first time, a Viking sat on the throne of all England. Sweyn's triumph, however, was brief. He died suddenly in early 1014, leaving his son Cnut to inherit the crown. But Ethelred returned from exile, reclaiming the throne and sending Cnut back to Denmark. It seemed for a moment as though the old order might be restored. Yet the wheel of fortune was still turning. Within 2 years, Cnut would return with a vast army, determined to finish what his father had begun. And in the years to come, England would become part of one of the largest empires the North Sea had ever seen. In our next chapter, we'll step into the world of Cnut the Great, the Viking who would rule not just England, but Denmark and Norway, forging a North Sea empire whose shadow would stretch across the medieval world. The winter seas are a dangerous place. The waves roll like the backs of great beasts, the wind cuts to the bone, and the sky often hangs low and heavy, threatening snow or sleet. Yet it was across such waters, in the closing years of the first millennium, that Cnut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, came once more to England. This time, he came not as a hopeful prince, but as a man with an army, a host large enough to challenge every Fiad, every bar, every shield wall that the Anglo-Saxons could muster. The year was 1015, and the throne of England, long fought over, would once again be decided by blood and steel. King Ethelred, old and weary from years of Viking onslaught, still wore the crown, but his kingdom was fraying. The endless Danegeld payments had drained the royal treasury. Trust between the king and his nobles was brittle, and in the shadows of every hall lurked whispers of betrayal. Cnut wasted no time. His ships beached along England's southern shores, and his warriors fanned out into the countryside. Town after town fell, not always to the sword, sometimes to fear, sometimes to negotiated surrender. By the time winter deepened, Cnut controlled much of the land south of the Thames. In April 1016, Ethelred died. His son, Edmund Ironside, took the crown, a man younger, stronger, and far more willing to fight than his father. The nickname Ironside came not from later legend, but from his sheer endurance. No matter how many battles were fought, no matter how often the odds turned against him, Edmund refused to yield. That year became one of relentless campaigning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a series of fierce encounters between Edmund and Cnut at Penselwood, Shurston, Brentford, and Otford. Each was bloody, each was inconclusive. The land itself seemed weary of war, its fields trampled, its villages burned. The struggle came to its climax at the Battle of Hastings in October 1016. The exact site of Hastings is still debated, but the chroniclers agree on its outcome. Cnut won a crushing victory. The reasons are still whispered by historians. Some speak of treachery among Edmund's ranks, others of Cnut's tactical brilliance. Whatever the cause, the result was decisive, and yet, in a moment that seems almost unthinkable for its time, the two rivals did not fight to the death. Instead, they met and agreed to divide the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex, the heartland of the Anglo-Saxons, and Cnut would take Mercia and the north. It was an uneasy peace, and a short one. Just weeks later, Edmund Ironside died suddenly, perhaps from wounds, perhaps from illness. His death left Cnut sole ruler of all England. Now crowned, Cnut did not simply return to Denmark and leave England in the hands of local lords. Instead, he made the island the jewel of his growing realm. Within a few years, he would also take the throne of Denmark, and later Norway, forging what came to be known as the North Sea Empire, a dominion where ships carried the king's will from London to Copenhagen, to Trondheim. Cnut's reign in England was a strange and remarkable chapter. He was, by blood and upbringing, a Viking, but he ruled like a king of the Anglo-Saxons. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, binding himself to the old royal line. He upheld many of the laws and customs of his new subjects, walking a careful line between Norse tradition and English expectation. The Viking raids that had plagued the coasts for decades all but ceased. Cnut maintained a standing force, the housecarls, to protect the realm, and he kept a fleet ready, not for plunder, but for defense. He reformed taxation, continued Alfred's system of shire governance, and supported the church, funding the repair and construction of monasteries and cathedrals. But Cnut was no gentle ruler. His early years on the throne saw acts of ruthless consolidation. Rivals were executed or exiled. Powerful earls who had backed Edmund Ironside were stripped of their lands or forced into service under the new king. England was divided into 4 great earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, each ruled by a trusted lieutenant. The king also moved with a kind of stagecraft, aware that his power depended on the image he projected. Chronicles tell of Cnut traveling to Rome in 1027 for the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, where he secured trading rights for English merchants and safe passage for pilgrims. In doing so, he presented himself not as a raider king, but as a Christian monarch of international standing. And yet, behind this order, the tensions of empire never fully disappeared. The North Sea was both a unifier and a barrier. Storms could delay communication for weeks, and rebellions could flare up on distant shores. In Norway, Cnut faced resistance from local rulers, and in Denmark, he had to fend off rival claimants. Still, in England, his reign brought something that had been rare for a century: stability. Children born in the 1020s grew up without the constant dread of sails on the horizon. Markets flourished, fields recovered, and the great monasteries of Ely, Winchester, and Canterbury once more became centers of learning and devotion. Cnut ruled until his death in 1035, and for all his efforts to secure the succession, the empire he had built began to fragment almost immediately. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, lacked his strength and skill, and the old rivalries between Anglo-Saxon and Dane resurfaced. But for a brief span, England had been at the heart of a northern empire, a realm where the tides carried the same king's law from the Humber to the fjords of Norway. Cnut's reign would be remembered not only for its scale, but for its strange duality. The Viking conqueror who became a Christian king, the foreigner who ruled like a native, the warlord who brought peace. Peace, however, was not permanent. For in the shadows of Normandy, a different kind of storm was gathering. One that would not come in longships, but in great, square-sailed vessels, bearing knights in mail and a claim to to the very throne of England. In our next chapter, we will witness the fall of the Danish kings in England and the events that set the stage for the Norman conquest. The death of Cnut in 1035 was like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of uncertainty spread in all directions. The North Sea Empire he had so carefully forged now faced the test that has undone many great realms: succession. Cnut had left behind 2 sons, Harold Harefoot, born to his first wife Aelfjafu of Northampton, and Harthacnut, his child with Queen Emma of Normandy. The problem was not simply one of bloodline, it was one of geography. Harthacnut, the elder, was in Denmark at the time of Cnut's death, securing his hold there against threats from Norway and the Slavic Wends. That left a gap in England, and in that gap, Harold Harefoot stepped forward. Harold's claim was shaky. Many of the great earls favored Harthacnut, particularly Earl Godwin of Wessex, whose power in southern England was considerable. But Harthacnut's absence dragged on, and the kingdom could not wait forever. At first, Harold was accepted only as regent, ruling on behalf of his half-brother. But the longer Harthacnut stayed away, the stronger Harold's position became. By 1037, Harold was crowned king in his own right. Queen Emma, Harthacnut's mother, and a powerful figure in her own regard, was driven into exile in Flanders. Her departure was more than a family quarrel. It was a sign that the balance of power in England was shifting again. Harold's reign was short, and for many bitter. He earned his nickname, Harefoot, from his speed and skill in hunting. But politically, he moved with a ruthless swiftness as well. One of the darkest episodes came in 1036, when Alfred Aetheling, the younger son of the old King Ethelred and Emma's child by him, returned from exile in Normandy. Alfred had likely come to visit his mother, but in the tangled politics of the time, he was seen as a threat to Harold's rule. Captured by Earl Godwin, perhaps acting under Harold's orders, Alfred was blinded and soon died of his wounds. The act shocked contemporaries, and its shadow would fall over Godwin's family for years to come. Harold's sudden death in 1040, likely from illness, opened the door for Harthacnut at last. Sailing from Denmark with a fleet, Harthacnut landed in England unopposed. His first acts as king were severe. He ordered Harold's body dug up from its grave in Westminster and thrown into the Thames, a public gesture of vengeance for the wrongs done to his mother and her allies. But Harthacnut's reign, too, was short-lived. He was a heavy drinker, and in 1042, while standing at a wedding feast, he collapsed and died, possibly from a stroke. With his passing, the Danish line in England came to an end. The crown now passed to a man who had been waiting in the wings for decades. Edward, known to history as Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred and Emma. Edward had spent much of his life in Normandy, growing up in the courts of his mother's kin. His upbringing gave him a pious, almost monastic manner. but it also left him somewhat distant from the political realities of England. When Edward returned to claim the throne, he did so with the support of Earl Godwin and his powerful family. This alliance was uneasy from the start. Edward distrusted Godwin for the death of his brother Alfred years before, but he also recognized that without the Earl of Wessex, his rule might not last. Edward's reign was marked by a curious mixture of peace at home and tension beneath the surface. The Viking threat, for now, had faded, replaced by a growing Norman influence. Edward favored his Norman friends and advisors, granting them lands and positions of power. This caused friction with the great English earls, particularly Godwin. One of the most dramatic confrontations came in 1051, when Edward accused Godwin of refusing to punish the townspeople of Dover for attacking a Norman entourage. The quarrel escalated until Godwin and his family were forced into exile. For a moment, it seemed the Norman faction at court would dominate. But by 1052, Godwin returned with an army, and Edward, unable to oppose him, restored him to power. The Godwin family's influence only grew from there. When Godwin died in 1053, his son Harold Godwinson inherited the earldom of Wessex, becoming the most powerful noble in England. Harold was a man of energy and ability, respected by warriors and statesmen alike. Edward, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn from worldly affairs, devoting much of his attention to religious matters. His great legacy would be the building of Westminster Abbey, begun in the 1040s, a church of unprecedented size and grandeur, intended to be his burial place and a symbol of royal piety. Yet beneath the outward calm of Edward's later reign lay a looming crisis. Edward had no children. As the years passed, the question of succession became more urgent. Various claimants began to circle. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. Harold Godwinson, by now the kingdom's de facto leader, seemed the natural choice for the English nobility. And across the sea in Norway, King Harald Hardrada, a warrior of legendary fame, saw an opportunity to revive Viking claims to England. When Edward died in January 1066, his passing set in motion one of the most famous years in English history. Harold Godwinson was crowned king, but his rivals were already preparing to stake their claims. The peace and stability of Edward's reign gave way to a year of battles that would end the Anglo-Saxon era altogether. In the next chapter, we will enter the fateful year of 1066, a year of 3 kings, 2 invasions, and 1 battle that would change the course of English history forever. The year began with the sound of morning bells. On the cold morning of January 5th, 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England for nearly a quarter of a century, lay dead in his bedchamber at Westminster. His great church, Westminster Abbey, had been consecrated only days earlier. A towering stone testament to his faith and ambition. Now, it would be the place of his burial. But Edward's death left more than a throne empty. It left a kingdom poised on the edge of chaos. For years, whispers of succession had swirled through the halls of power, but Edward had left no clear heir. And in the days of the Anglo-Saxons, an empty throne was not simply filled by the next in line. It was seized by the one strong enough, cunning enough, and swift enough to take it. On January 6th, the very next day after Edward's death, the Witnagemot, the Council of England's leading nobles and churchmen, gathered in urgent session. The man they chose was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful noble in the land. He had led armies, negotiated treaties, and held the kingdom together during Edward's long absences from the daily affairs of rule. For the English lords, Harold was not only the best choice, he was the only choice to keep the realm intact. But far across the Channel, in Normandy, another man believed the crown should be his. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that years earlier, Edward had promised him the English throne. William also insisted that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support this claim. An oath made, William said, upon holy relics. During a visit Harold had made to Normandy. To William, Harold's coronation was not just a political slight, it was a betrayal. And in the north, yet another figure watched events unfold. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a warrior whose life had been forged in the fire of battle. Harold had fought in the lands of the Rus, served in the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard, and returned to rule Norway with an iron hand. His claim to England was based on an old agreement between earlier kings of Norway and Denmark. But for Harold, claims were only as good as the swords that backed them. Thus the stage was set for a year unlike any other. 3 men, each believing himself rightful king of England, prepared to stake their claim, and none intended to yield. The first months of Harold's reign were uneasy, but calm. He knew an invasion was coming. The only question was from which direction. William was gathering ships in Normandy, but the winds of the Channel could be fickle, delaying any crossing for weeks or months. Harald Hardrada's threat lay to the north, across the cold waters of the North Sea. Harold positioned his forces carefully, watching and waiting. Summer came and went, and still the winds kept William's fleet in harbor. In the south, Harold kept his army on alert along the coast. But by early September, the Fiad, the levy of common soldiers, could no longer be kept in the field. Men had harvests to bring in, supplies were running low. Harold dismissed them, trusting that the danger had passed for the year. It was then, in mid-September, that the storm broke, but not in the south. News came racing down from the north. Harald Hardrada had landed in Yorkshire with a fleet of hundreds of longships, joined by Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, who sought revenge against him. Harold moved with astonishing speed, gathering his housecarls, and summoning what forces he could along the way. He marched north from London to York in less than a week, a feat of endurance that left men and horses exhausted, but ready to fight. On September 25th, at Stamford Bridge, Harold met Hardrada's army. The battle was fierce and brutal. The Norwegians, taken by surprise in the late summer heat, fought valiantly, but Harold's forces pressed them hard. Harold Hardrada fell in the fighting, pierced through the throat by an arrow. Tostig was slain as well. Of the vast fleet that had brought the Norwegians over, only a handful of ships returned to Norway. The Viking Age, in a sense, ended that day, its last great warrior king lying dead on an English field. But even in victory, Harold's trial was not over. 3 days later, as his men were still tending to the wounded and burying the dead, word came from the south. William had landed at Pevensey in Sussex. His fleet, delayed for months, had crossed the Channel at last, taking advantage of the northerly winds that had carried Harold to Stamford Bridge. Without rest, Harold turned his army southward. The march from York to London, and then on to Hastings, was grueling. Many of his men, already weary from the northern campaign, struggled to keep pace. But there was no time to gather fresh levies. William was already ravaging the countryside, seeking to draw Harold into battle. On October 14th, 1066, the two armies met on a ridge near the town of Hastings. Harold's forces took the high ground, forming the shield wall, a formation that had served the Anglo-Saxons well for generations. William's Normans advanced in 3 divisions, Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, and French on the right, each with archers, infantry, and cavalry. The fighting lasted from morning until dusk. Time and again, the Norman cavalry charged up the slope, only to be driven back by the unyielding shield wall. At one point, the Breton flank faltered, and part of Harold's army pursued them downhill, only to be surrounded and cut down when William's men wheeled around. The tide began to turn. Late in the day, disaster struck the English. Whether by arrow or by sword, Harold Godwinson was slain. Some accounts say an arrow pierced his eye, others that he fell beneath Norman blades. With their king dead, the English line collapsed. The field at Hastings was left strewn with the bodies of the last great Anglo-Saxon army. William, Duke of Normandy, had won. But the conquest was not yet complete. It would take further campaigns, brutal suppression of rebellions, and the building of castles across the land before his rule was secure. Still, the Battle of Hastings marked the moment when the crown of England passed from the hands of its native kings to those of a foreign dynasty. The year 1066 had begun with Edward the Confessor on the throne, and the Anglo-Saxon order still intact. By its end, 3 kings had worn the crown, and a new age had dawned, the age of the Normans. In our next chapter, we will follow the first years of Norman rule, a time of harsh change, of lands taken and laws rewritten, and of a kingdom reshaped forever. When the autumn winds swept over the field at Hastings, the air carried not just the smell of blood and trampled grass, but the passing of an age. The Anglo-Saxon world, the kingdom forged from scattered tribes, tested by centuries of Viking assault, and bound together under kings from Alfred to Edward, lay broken. In its place rose something new, foreign, and unyielding: the rule of William, Duke of Normandy. The victory at Hastings was decisive, but it did not give William instant control over England. The southeast lay open to him, but the north and west were not yet his. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, stunned by Harold Godwinson's death, quickly gathered in London to choose a new king. Their choice was Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandson of Edmund Ironside. Edgar had a royal bloodline, the last living male of the House of Wessex, but he had no army and no battle experience. William knew this, and he moved with calculated speed. Instead of marching straight on London, he swung westward, cutting a path through Kent, securing Dover and Canterbury, then moving into the Thames Valley. His army burned villages, seized supplies, and forced towns to submit. The strategy was as much psychological as military. Each act of destruction reminded the English that resistance would be costly. By December, William had reached the outskirts of London. The city, weary and leaderless, opened its gates. On Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the very church Edward the Confessor had built, William was crowned King of England. The crown was placed upon his head by Archbishop Ealdred of York, but the ceremony nearly ended in disaster. As Norman soldiers outside heard the shouts of acclamation from within, they thought a riot had broken out and began setting fire to nearby houses. Smoke filled the air, and panic rippled through the congregation. Still, the crown was set, and the transformation of England began. The first years of Norman rule were years of fire. William faced rebellions in nearly every part of the kingdom. In 1067, he returned briefly to Normandy, leaving trusted regents in charge. But uprisings in Kent, Devon, and the Welsh border soon broke out. In 1068, the north erupted. Edgar Atheling, with support from the Earls Edwin and Morcar, rose against him. William marched north, building castles at Warwick and York to secure his hold. But the greatest rebellion came in the winter of 1069-70, when Danish forces, distant cousins of the old Viking raiders, landed in the Humber to aid the English cause. York fell to the rebels, and for a moment it seemed the north might be lost. William responded with a campaign so brutal that it would be remembered with dread for centuries. The harrying of the north. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. Entire regions were laid waste, their people starving or driven into the cold. Chroniclers wrote that, from York to Durham, no house was left standing, and famine devoured the land. This was not war in the old Anglo-Saxon style, where victory was followed by tribute or submission. This was a deliberate breaking of a land's spirit, an imprint of Norman power carved into the soil itself. The changes that followed were just as profound. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the earls and thanes, whose families had ruled for generations, were swept away. Their lands were confiscated and granted to William's Norman followers, men who had crossed the Channel with him, fought at Hastings, and now held England as their reward. Within a generation, almost every great estate in England was in Norman hands. William's control was cemented not just through men, but through stone. Across the kingdom, castles rose stark, towering symbols of the new order. The Motte and Bailey design, with a wooden keep on a high mound surrounded by a palisade, could be built quickly and defended by a small garrison. From these fortresses, Norman lords could dominate the surrounding countryside and suppress revolt before it gathered force. The Anglo-Saxon world had known fortified burhs, but these castles were something different, personal strongholds of power, designed not to protect the people, but to enforce the ruler's will. Language itself began to shift. The Norman rulers spoke French, the court, the law, and the church increasingly did the same. Old English survived in the mouths of the common people, but it began to blend with the words of the conquerors. Over time, this fusion would give birth to the English language as we know it. But in the immediate years, after 1066, it was a marker of division. Those who ruled spoke one tongue, and those who were ruled spoke another. The church, too, felt the Norman touch. William replaced many of the old Anglo-Saxon bishops with Norman appointees. Cathedrals were rebuilt in the grand Romanesque style, with soaring arches and thick stone walls. The spiritual heart of England began to reflect the architecture of Normandy. Yet, for all this transformation, echoes of the Anglo-Saxon past endured. In law, the Normans retained many of the customs and practices they found, blending them with their own feudal codes. In the countryside, the rhythms of farming life went on as they always had. And in the telling of history, the memory of the old kings, Alfred, Athelstan, Edgar, and Edward, remained alive in the minds of the people. By 1086, 2 decades after Hastings, William's rule was undisputed. That year, he ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, a vast survey of his realm. It recorded every village, every piece of land, every head of livestock, a meticulous account of what was owned and who held it. It was a tool of governance, but also of dominance. The king knew exactly what was his and what could be taxed or taken. When William died in 1087, he was buried not in England, but in Caen, in Normandy. His sons would inherit his divided lands, Normandy to Robert, England to William Rufus, and the story of the Norman kings would continue. But the Anglo-Saxon era was over. It had lasted barely 6 centuries, from the arrival of the first Germanic settlers on Britain's shores to that October day at Hastings. In that time, the Anglo-Saxons had forged kingdoms, fought Vikings, crafted laws, and built a culture whose roots still run deep in England today. The Norman conquest did not erase them, but it transformed them. Their language became part of a greater whole, their customs adapted to a new order. Their memory became a chapter in a longer story, the story of England itself. And so, as the mists of time close over the fields where shield walls once stood, we remember the Anglo-Saxons not as a people who vanished, but as the foundation upon which the next 1,000 years of English history would be built. And that is where our long journey comes to rest, with the echoes of an age gone by, still faintly heard in the hills, the rivers, and the ancient stones of the land they once called home. If you've journeyed with me through this chapter of history and felt the pull of the past, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel so you can wander through more forgotten ages with me. Nights filled with kings, battles, and the quiet turning of centuries. And tell me, from where in the world are you listening right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know which corners of the earth we're dreaming together from. Until next time, rest well and let history keep you company.